a little bit more about risk governance, and we'll be focusing at the enterprise level, right? Of course, you already have a basic understanding of what is risk tolerance and what is risk budgeting, but we will talk a little bit more about how you take an enterprise-wide view, and then we'll get into a little bit more detailed discussion about how does one go about doing the risk budgeting, what are the different units, etc. Right. So now, what about the enterprise-wide view? For example, let's say you're managing a pension fund, right? And you've got your liabilities, which is the pension you have to pay out, and then the assets that your investments, that what you're doing with that money. Now, you can't just focus on the assets and say, oh, I'm going to try and optimize these assets in terms of their risk and return. You have to look at your liabilities as well, right? Because let's say you have to pay out money next year and you're investing in assets like 30-year government bonds because you think the risk return trade-off is optimum in those assets, right? You can't take an asset only approach. You have to take an asset liability approach, which is something you learn more about when you get into level 2 and level 3. But the point here is that you have to take an enterprise-wide approach. Let me give you another example. Let's say we're not talking about pension fund. Let's say we're talking about a investment company like ADIA, which is the sovereign investment wealth fund of the Abu Dhabi government. Now they might have an investment in an airline like Etihad, right? And they might have another investment in an oil and gas company like ADNOC. Now, if oil price goes up, right, obviously ADNOC will benefit because it sells oil. But if oil price goes down, Etihad will benefit because it buys oil for its airline operations. So how much exposure does ADIA have to oil? Can we say, oh, it has too much exposure because ADNOC will lose money if oil goes down? Yeah, that's true, but Etihad will benefit. So we have to take an enterprise-wide view, and it may be that when you put everything together and then have a look, you might not need to hedge. So let's say they might have more exposure to oil in terms of its value going down because ADNOC might be bigger than Etihad, right? But there is still some benefit that will be there from oil going down to Etihad operations. So we don't have to completely hedge that entire situation. We might have to partially hedge it. So before you actually go into the risk management and the hedging, right, it's better to take the entire organization-wide view and then decide, okay, how much do I want to hedge? And then, of course, this has to be done by the risk governance committee and then your chief risk officer, and then you'll have your entire team of risk management coming under the CRO. But just keep in mind that all the big decisions are taken in the BOD, right? So these guys will all work for the BOD and then put all the paperwork back up to the board of directors, and they are the ones who are going to decide. So what else do we need to discuss? Inside view and outside view. So let's say again with the Etihad airline example, now there could be outside factors such as COVID, right, because of which the sales of the airline could drop, or there could be an outside factor such as oil price, right, going up, which could mean bad news for the cost of this airline, right? Or it could be inside view that something within the organization is not working, right? Maybe they were not able to operate certain flights on time or something like that. Similarly, let's talk about another organization. Let's say ADNOC, the oil producing company. Again, the oil price going down would be bad for them, but that's outside their organization, and them not being able to manage the production at a certain, let's say uptime of 90% or 95%, that would be an inside problem. So in terms of risk, we need to see, okay, what could happen which would impact our profit that is internal to us, and what could happen which is external to us, right? And this is all going to set the context for how much risk should we be then willing to take, right? And I think a very common question is that Okay, so the bigger the organization, the higher the risk they can take. And the answer is no. And think of Charles Darwin, right? What he said was, it's not the strongest that survives. It's not the fastest species that survives. It's the one which is most adaptable to change. And similarly with your risk tolerance as well, what the key word that is being used over here is responding dynamically, right? Think of being agile. So agility, because the only thing constant in the world is change. So you've got these and think of like COVID or, so many adverse events that can be there. The real question is, how agile are you? How dynamic you are to change? I mean, for example, BlackBerry was not able to change with the changing dynamics of the smartphone industry, right? Or Nokia. So it's not that the bigger you are, the higher the level of risk you can take. The more agile and dynamic you are, the higher level of risk tolerance you can have. So this is another exam level question, that what is the driver for allowing for a relatively higher level of risk tolerance? Well, it's the ability of the organization to dynamically respond to adverse events, right? And then of course, once the risk tolerance is set, then the amount of risk appetite you can take, and then you can now move to risk budgeting, that okay, let me now start taking that much exposure, right? And if I'm taking too much exposure, then I can reduce it by using strategies. But strategies of hedging strategies are going to be coming after my risk budgeting has been done. It's not going to be the other way around, right? So, I mean, you have to remember that this process is flowing top down, that based on my internal and external situation and my dynamic ability and agility to respond, I'm going to decide, okay, how much risk tolerance I want to keep. And then based on that, I'll develop my risk budget. And that could be in a lot of different units, right? I mean, it could be in standard deviation terms or beta terms. And let's say I want a zero beta. I want a beta of 0, no market risk, which means then I need to check what is the beta in my portfolio, and I need to then short sell some market ETF, right? And that's a hedging strategy, so that I take my beta to 0 and I'm market neutral. You could also have a lot of different scenarios where we could look at something called standard deviation. If you want a total risk, you could use value at risk, right? You could look at different scenarios. And we'll talk a little bit more about value and risk and the scenario analysis shortly, because that is a discussion I want to have with you in detail. But let's park that for now, and we'll come back to value at risk shortly. But what I want to now talk about first with you is should we have just one dimensional risk measure? Is it that, our only focus is that we want to be market neutral, or can we have multiple dimensions as well? So the answer is yes, you can have multiple dimensions as well. So for example, I would say, okay, I have a balanced fund. I've got some stocks, I've got some bonds. What I want the stocks to be market neutral, so long short, right? Beta of 0. And for my bonds, I want a modified duration of, let's say, 2% or something like this, right? So I can have a mod D, or I can have a MACD of, let's say, I want my MACD to be 3 years. So we can have this type of a multiple dimensions as well. And of course, the lower the risk you take, the most likely the lower the return you're going to get. So that's definitely a trade-off. Let's have a look at a few questions before we move on. So which of the following approaches is most consistent with the enterprise view of risk governance, right? So we're looking at an enterprise-wide view, which is the most consistent. Now, what people who don't follow the enterprise-wide view, they look at things in silos. So a very common word you'll see used is that risk management is being done in silos. So let's say I'll do ADNOC separately, right? I'll do Etihad Airlines separately, which means I'm looking at this entire business in different silos, which is not good. What I have to do is I have to look at it together, right? So separate strategic planning processes for each part, which is basically in silos of the entire enterprise. Is this most consistent with enterprise view of risk governance? Of course not, right? This is the exact opposite, that it is being done in silos, and we don't want that. What about B? Considering an organization's risk tolerance when developing its asset allocation. That sounds pretty good, right? I mean, we talked about the pension fund where we said, hey, you have to not only look at the assets, but you have to look at the liabilities as well, right? Or you don't have to look at the risk exposure, you have to look at the risk tolerance as well. So that sounds like a pretty decent statement. But let's read C before we choose B, because B is good, but it's not just about enterprise view, right? It's about a general high level risk management statement, but it is a correct statement. So let's read C. Trying to achieve the highest possible risk adjusted return on a company's pension fund assets. So that's definitely wrong, right? That's definitely wrong, because we're not considering the liabilities, which is something you have to do when you talk about enterprise view. So just by process of elimination, we can say C is definitely wrong and A is also wrong, especially with respect to enterprise risk management. So B is just the generally correct statement. Okay. So which of the following statements about risk tolerance is most accurate? Risk tolerance is best discussed after a crisis? Definitely not. What do you think, right? I mean, are we going to come and sit together and say, okay, let's decide how much risk we want to take? What is our risk tolerance or our risk appetite after the crisis? Well, usually people would do that, but that is not the right way of going about it, right? Okay, let's read B. The risk tolerance discussion is about the actions the management will take to minimize losses. Risk tolerance is done much before that, right? What did we discuss? We said first the BOD is going to get together, do the risk governance, set the tolerance level. Then the management is going to take some actions to take that risk exposure, and then it's going to be identified, and then we're going to reduce it. So these actions are referring to the hedging strategies, which is done much after the risk tolerance, right? Risk tolerance is done much before the risk exposure and the measurement and then the hedging, etc. So this, of course, is also going to be wrong. The organization's risk tolerance describes the extent to which the organization is willing to experience losses. Fantastic. Perfect, right? So this is obviously going to be the answer here. All right. Which of the following is not consistent with a risk budgeting approach? Limiting the beta to portfolio of 0.75. That sounds right? And we're looking for not consistent. So that's not an answer. Allocating investments by their amount of underlying risk sources. That sounds right too, right? So that's not going to be an answer. Limiting the amount of money available to be spent on hedging strategies by each portfolio manager. That sounds really silly. I mean, when you're limiting, so, it starts off with a nice word because, obviously it's risk budget. We want to limit the risk. We don't want to limit the amount of money they want to spend on hedging strategies. What we want to limit is the risk. So this is definitely not consistent. Okay. Who would be the least appropriate for controlling the risk management function in a large organization? Chief Risk Officer, Chief Financial Officer, Chief Risk Management Committee. What do you think? It is definitely not the Chief Risk Officer and the Risk Management Committee, because that's their role, right? Chief Financial Officer or even your CEO would not be appropriate, because these guys would want to increase the risk, right? Their compensation is probably, their bonus is probably going to come from the high return, from the high performance. So you can't have these guys controlling the risk management function. And to be honest, this is what has been happening. This whole concept of having a CRO and having a risk management committee is relatively newer. And this is an awareness that has to be increased, right? We've had such catastrophes. Just look at the Enron scandal, right? Of course, their CEO and CFO wanted to make more money, and then they ended up doing all of this. Of course, eventually somebody blew the whistle. But the point is that if they had a risk management committee doing its job, if they had the chief risk officer doing their job, then it wouldn't have happened, right? Because there is a conflict of interest within the CFO and the CEO, that on one side, they want that higher performance, but on the other side, they're not supposed to take so much risk, especially for the other stakeholders, the minority shareholders, the junior employees, right? So definitely the least appropriate would be the CEO and CFO. Right, guys, let's take a break. We'll come back and then jump into what are the different risks within financial, within non-financial, and then what's the interplay between them.